Welcome back to the last part of chapter one. And this will be super easy. I most probably will be done in like in 10, 15 minutes, I think. So now we spoke a lot about, what biology is, and then we spoke about, biology is the study of life on Earth. Then we defined what life is, and then we went on just to know or to study more how do we actually, uh, just study biology. How can someone be a scientist, and how can someone actually go into the scientific method from going for an observation to basically creating a hypothesis, a prediction, an experiment, and then which gives you results and a conclusion. All this kind of stuff. So of course, throughout your biological, let's say, career, either be it in this bachelor's or if you go into med school or you go to your master's or you continue on to a PhD, you're gonna the amount of information that you will be bombarded with in biology is too much. It's a lot. And that can be extremely overwhelming, for some people. And it's, of course, people, what they like to do is put them under certain themes. Yeah, that's too much. There's too many themes in biology, and that can be, quite also extremely overwhelming in that kind of sense. So in this thing, what the best thing to do is kind of unify these themes into these kind of concepts in biology. And today we're going to talk about five main concepts in biology that are extremely, let's say, quite unify multiple different types of themes. The first one is life is subject to chemical and physical laws. This might sound extremely stupid, but it's so true. Whenever we're gonna be teaching today, or not today, sorry, in this kind of course, we're gonna talk a lot about a lot of cellular processes. We're gonna be going example like creating ATP, like energy, to creating, certain amino acids or creating proteins, you name it. All of that is literally chemical bonding, it's molecular bonding. So we are following a lot of chemical properties. And when you create, let's say, big proteins and these other kind of stuff, you need ATP, you need energy. And how that energy flows basically from one entity to the other, that is also a physical property. That's thermodynamics. So what are we trying to simply say in this basically kind of concept is that there's going to be a lot of themes within, molecular bonding, with thermodynamics, all this kind of stuff. And you can keep this in your head as one main concept that life follows these chemical physical laws. It doesn't create new ones. No, no, no. It follows chemical preset, like set chemical and physical laws. So always keep that in mind. The second one, structure determines function. This is super important, and as for scientists, it actually helps us a lot when discovering new things. I'll give you here an example, basically, what that means. Let's imagine we actually get a picture of what the insulin receptor looks like on a human cell. So, insulin receptor is this receptor that we all know that is extremely important for uptaking glucose, basically, glucose. So, insulin goes into the receptor in your human endocells, and it kind of tells the cell like, hey, it's time to start taking glucose from the bloodstream into the cell. So we get to know the structure. Awesome. Then we go and we start studying, let's say, a worm, and we see a new protein that has almost an identical structure of that of the insulin receptor. You can already say it's like, okay, this could actually mean that this is an insulin receptor because there's so much homology between organisms, as I was saying, through evolution, because we had a common ancestor and we share a lot of similar things. That's one example. Another example is we start sometimes seeing kind of this kind of proteins that have like kind of these finger-like projections, a structure that looks like fingers. So why would a protein have finger-like projections? So you start thinking, what do we use our fingers for? Well, mostly to grab on stuff. That's what gives us literally a huge advantage over a lot of animals. Like, for example, dogs. Dogs cannot grab something because they don't have these appendages of fingers that we do. So when you see a protein that has these fingers, they're grabbing onto something. And then they realize that, yeah, these proteins that have this kind of finger-like projections, they're grabbing onto DNA. So they actually use that structure to do a function. So by looking at structure, you can determine a function, and it can be so many different things going into basically uh, molecular biology. It can go actually into more more into the biology of animals, or you name it. when you start seeing proteins or seeing different chemicals, if you look at the structure, that can actually give you a lot of the function. If that structure is quite specific, and we've seen this before, it can help you to actually determine a function. Third one, living systems transform energy and matter. All life requires energy quite constantly. We need it wherever we go. Either from our case, humans, we like to, of course, take in food to destroy it in order to take basically, create energy. We like to oxidize certain molecules, and specifically glucose or fatty acids or basically other proteins to actually create ATP. Well, going into photosynthetic organisms, basically like plants, they love to take in the the sunlight. They take the sunlight and then which they're then able to convert that sunlight into a organic molecule like certain carbohydrates. So we're constantly transforming, energy. We're creating, for example, from we eat, let's say, a sandwich, then we're trying to convert that into energy, into ATP. Or in the case of a plant, they take up energy from the sandwich, then convert it into matter. We're trying to convert it into carbohydrates. That is matter. So we're always transforming energy and matter. And the big source of energy is literally the sun. Without it, life would not exist. We would not have ordered complexity. We would not be able to actually get, let's say, big proteins or more complex structures like a mitochondria or whole organism. Because think about this. If you have no energy, you have this under certain thermodynamic constant, meaning that there's not a lot of energy being passed around. Amino acids will, you might have a huge pool of amino acids, but if there's no energy, nothing's gonna make them actually build together to create a protein. Only when basically you have energy that mostly coming from the sun, it pushes it to actually get these amino acids to get into a structure to organize and give up complexity, to give ordered complexity. So that's how important this is, what this means. Fourth, living systems depend on information transactions. So, us living systems, basically any living system, us humans, going to bacteria, to basically to fungi, to whatever, or to any other animals, we have nucleic acids, and most of this is basically DNA. We need DNA to basically to survive. We depend on it because this DNA contains four different nucleotides, and these four new different nucleotides create the whole macro molecule of a DNA. So these four more nucleotides are give you a certain, let's say, specific sequence that encodes for proteins. So we can have, let's say, a series of different, of basically of a nucleotide sequence, that are different. For example, A, C, C, D, T, G, G, whatever. Like this sequence that can encode for a protein, like insulin, for example, or can encode, or it can encode for a certain receptor that we need. Okay, so a piece of DNA that fully encodes a protein, that's called a gene. That's a discrete unit of information. It's literally one unit of DNA that encodes for a full gene. Genome is the entire set of DNA instructions, the whole damn thing. So careful, don't uh, confuse them. Gene is a discrete unit of information. Genome is the whole damn thing. And of course, for us to continue life, one thing that we need is that our cells, when they are basically multiplying, they need to copy DNA. Because if a cell doesn't have DNA, it doesn't have the instructions for life. Because proteins is what gives us life. Without DNA, there's no instructions. It's like literally getting a cook without the recipes. The cook is not going to be able to do anything without the recipes. Same thing with the cell. If the cell doesn't have its recipes, which is from DNA, it's not going to be able to create new proteins and it's not going to be able to live. That's extremely important. DNA is used to direct synthesis of cellular components. Cellular components are made of proteins. So DNA is needed to create cellular components because it's the instructions of certain proteins that come together to give a cellular component. Certain so the control of gene expression leads to different cells and tissue types. So what's the difference? So what makes, let's say, a liver cell, and basically a muscle cell, a muscle cell? What's the difference between a muscle cell and a liver cell? Well, it's the type of actually genes that are expressed. And of course, liver cells have certain genes that are expressed that give certain proteins that basically you start creating certain proteins that the liver cell should have. Well, the muscle cell has other genes that are expressed that give other proteins, things that basically a muscle cell needs. So literally, the cells are have the exact same DNA, but some parts of the DNA in the muscle cell are activated and the others are and the liver cell are activated because this is what gives the difference. Certain genes being turned on compared to the others. And then, of course, the cells need to, of course, always adapt to your environmental information. For example, in the case of glucose, when you have extreme amounts of glucose level, your pancreas actually realizes this and it starts to see, okay, glucose in the blood. This is very dangerous because if there's too much glucose in the blood, this can bind to your red blood cells and it can cause necrosis. It literally can create black holes in your skin. It's extremely dangerous and can kill you. That's why having diabetes can be deadly. So your pancreas has to be able to notice that or able to kind of process that information. So it's able to process it, and then suddenly certain genes, like basically the DNA of that encodes for insulin, has to be turned on. So then the pancreatic cells literally get this piece of DNA from insulin and they start transcribing into mRNA and then creating the protein that is insulin and then it's secreted, which is then the insulin goes into basically other cells of your skin, of your basically of your body. It binds to the receptor and it tells the cell like, okay, we need to start uptaking literally glucose. And how does it do that? Insulin binds to the receptor. The receptor turns on proteins that go into your DNA and start basically transcribing parts of the DNA that encode for transporters. These transporters go and take up or transport the glucose inside the cell. So this is how important DNA is. It really helps, of course, give you the type of cell because depending on what proteins you need, muscle cells needs these proteins, liver cells need these proteins, then the DNA has the information for it. And then, of course, it helps it adapt to the environmental information. Last one, evolution explains unity and diversity. So, all organisms, every single organism that there's today, descends from one simple creature. So, we have one common ancestor that was basically born 3.5 billion years ago. That common ancestor started to change, to evolve into multiple different, basically, species and populations that are us right now. So, that's why we have, humans, then we have dogs, then we have cats, and you name it. We all came from one literally creature that started to evolve and go out. And they're actually something that kind of leads to for us to say that is that one thing that preserves us that every single organism has is DNA. Every single organism has DNA. That's because this simple creature had it, and it kept going because we needed to live. But not just that. There are certain genes that every single organism has it because most probably without them you cannot live. And these are the basically homeodomain proteins, which I'll explain in a bit. But what I'm trying to say is that, you know, underlying unity of biochemistry and genetics argues for life from the same origin event, meaning that we come from basically the same creature, or this kind of basically this common ancestor that was born 3.5 billion years ago. And that's what unifies us. And then diversity started to happen because of evolution. Basically, certain environments change. Basically, if this creature was basically in this part of the world and then the other creature was in the other world, it evolves because of natural selection. That's what happens. We start to diversify. But one thing that we see that is super diverse and basically, sorry, that's something that unifies us, that every single living organism has, is this homeodomain proteins. These are proteins that are literally found in every living, basically, organism and in the three kingdoms of life, in fungi, in plants, and in animals. And these are extremely important in the development of life. They help us basically develop. So, for example, Ali, we talked about this in class and in my previous video. Certain homeodomain proteins in the fruit fly help it to basically to say where the leg should be in. Because if you mutate it, suddenly this Drosophila will start literally having uh, the leg on its eye. So these proteins really regulate the development fate of these kind of living organisms. But one thing that we start to see is that, okay, other than all of us have them, all living creatures have it, they can look extremely very similar. So this is literally called a phylogenetic tree. So what that means is that the closer one branch is to the other, it means it resembles the other much more. So they literally took the homeo box genes, the homeodomain genes from basically this mouse, this mus molluscus, which basically means mouse, from this Saccharomyces cerevisiae, which is basically yeast, and this plants, this Arabidopsis. So basically, this mouse has two different homeodomain genes, sorry, maize and PEM. But surprisingly, they don't look so similar to each other. They're quite different, and this maize is so similar to the ones actually found in the plant and also in the yeast. So imagine we have genes, these homeodomain genes. The mouse has homeodomain genes that are extremely similar to the ones in the plant and in Saccharomyces more than itself. So this is where you see how diverse organisms like a mouse, a plant, and a yeast are unified because they have similar proteins that are governing literally life. So what I'm simply trying to say here is that we have some unity together, that one common descendant, so one common ancestor, started to evolve into all these different species that exist. And we really can see that in basically the genes or certain characteristics like DNA, for example, or genes that are so similar to each other. So we might be so diverse, but there's things that unifies us. That's what I'm trying to put this in this kind of concept. So this is the end of chapter 1. Please always feel free to email me or send me a WhatsApp message if you have any questions, and I'll definitely be there to help you.